I received an email today from someone who asked me how I thought the Trump and Obama foreign policies are similar on foreign policy. So I wanted to do a video on that. Um, I think there are five big ways where Trump and Obama are similar on foreign policy. So number one is the the circumstances in which they both came to power in the first place, and both Trump and Obama, in their own way, were outsider candidates who, in large part, they began as underdogs, but they took off because they offered a critique or an alternative of conventional wisdom on foreign policy, and specifically were responsive to concerns among the public that the U.S. was spending too much time and energy and resources on an interventionist foreign policy at the expense of domestic affairs. So in Obama's case, a big part of the rationale for his candidacy against Hillary Clinton was his consistent opposition to the Iraq War, which distinguished him from other mainstream Democrats. And if you remember correctly, sort of right at the outset of his campaign and so forth, Obama used to talk about doing more nation building at home. And this was something that a strategy that Trump also very much adopted. He campaigned actively on America First, which was something that we haven't had a candidate really campaign on positively, just given the associations of that term with an isolationist period of history. And to me, the most remarkable part of Trump's foreign policy critique was at a debate in South Carolina, where he was obviously up on the podium with the other candidates, and he lambasted the Iraq War, repeated his claim that he had been against it, and then went even further and said that the Bush administration lied about the Iraq War. I mean, this is something that would have been inconceivable even a few years ago. Like I remember in that South Carolina debate, Romney and all the other candidates teamed up and ganged up on Ron Paul for saying the same thing. But now, just a few years later, here Trump was being rewarded for it. So both Trump and Obama came to office on a platform, on a campaign promise, with a political constituency that had put them in office in order to retrench from the world and engage more on domestic affairs. And that was a mandate that impacted their ability to maneuver once they were in office. Now, so that goes to the second similarity, goes to why Obama and Trump were able to credibly articulate this kind of a critique on foreign policy. And the way that I would put it is that they both, in an important sense, take issue with the idea that, one, the concept of American exceptionalism, and two, by extension, that traditional understandings of American exceptionalism ought to guide our foreign policy. Obama famously had said in an interview that he believes in American exceptionalism the way the Greeks believe in the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism and so forth. What he was basically trying to argue in kind of a clumsy way was that every great power or great civilization believes that they're exceptional. Trump said it in more crude ways, like when confronted about the human rights abuses of Russia or Saudi Arabia. He kind of dismisses it a little bit and says, well, we do bad things too, or like he said in Helsinki, that we also meddle in other countries and so forth. So their critics sort of criticize them for like being anti-American or being morally relativistic. I don't think that that's accurate, but I do think that both of them maybe guided by a certain sense of realism. They believe that America engages in realpolitik and in a certain kind of foreign policy that's similar to other countries, that the U.S. has made mistakes. And so they have I would say, less of a belief in American exceptionalism, less of a belief in America's innate kind of morality or right to dictate to other countries. And this kind of a skepticism about American exceptionalism is a common feature of their foreign policy, and one that shows up in their relative reluctance to promote human rights or to issue very kind of idealistic oration or oratory, and to engage on a more transactional terms in foreign policy. Number three is that for all their intuitions and critiques, they've by and large preserved and upheld the main tenets of U.S. foreign policy that have guided the U.S. conduct and U.S. strategy since the end of the Cold War. So if you look at the debates that were occurring as, one, the Cold War ended, and then two, ultimately when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was very much a live debate in the country on exactly how much, what kind of a role the U.S. should play in the world, and a lot of erstwhile Cold War hawks like Eugene Kirkpatrick and Pat Buchanan were now arguing that the U.S. should really substantially retrench. Ted Kennedy, for example, is calling for very significant steep cuts in the defense budget. And the way that whole debate basically worked out in the end, to some degree, one from the tail end of the Bush administration, and then really with the Clinton administration, was a consensus that the U.S. would remain the world's sole superpower, that it would underwrite a liberal international order, that it would maintain an active set of military and economic alliances, and that the U.S. basically would play this kind of a role. And this is a set of assumptions that, while every administration has modified it to some degree with their own doctrine, that Obama basically consolidated and preserved much of what he inherited from the Bush administration, and likewise, Trump has largely, despite some, like Obama, some more far-reaching rhetoric in terms of policy, have basically maintained the main lines of American strategy, and in a sense, both are status quo presidents. Now, this goes to the fourth point, and it goes to part of why they've retained so many of the main tenets or main lines in American foreign policy, which is their relatively indulgent approach or attitude to the way that to the foreign policy establishment and how they've staffed their own administrations. So on the one hand, both as candidates campaigned against the foreign policy establishment, they criticized the people who had been in power, they criticized the permanent class for being erring in various judgments. And they continued to do that throughout their presidency. So like Obama famously, I think it was in the context of Libya, he really began to have serious questions about the foreign policy establishment, called them the blob, the DC blob at one point. Trump has also been very dismissive of the foreign policy establishment. Like, I remember when I was on the campaign, he simply refused to take foreign policy advisors seriously. Like, every now and then he might indulge them with a meeting or something, but really he was skeptical of these people. He didn't like them. At one point, actually, I heard this from a reliable source, but he basically questioned the masculinity or the manliness of foreign policy establishment, and he preferred to get advice from generals, actually in a way like Obama did in some ways. But at the same time, even though they had this criticism, ambivalence, at times contempt for the foreign policy establishment, basically if you look at who they actually appointed to both at a senior but also at a mid and junior level in their foreign policy bureaucracies, they basically rewarded the foreign policy establishment with most of these jobs. And they did so despite, in my view, having a mandate to bring in a new team, bring in outsiders, bring in people from outside the foreign policy establishment. And so not surprisingly, when they brought in these people who had been from the same DC foreign policy establishment, the same churn, they weren't especially eager to oversee any kind of a revolution in foreign policy. Now, a big part of that, I would add too, has to do with their donors. That although both of them, especially early on in their candidacies, really campaigned on the fact that they were not going to be reliant on the same moneyed interest. By the time they got to the general election, they were every bit as beholden to big companies, big banks, big multinationals, others that had a stake in a consistent foreign policy. And then number 5 is the way that they've managed the domestic realities of our foreign policy challenges. So I think both of them in their own ways probably recognize that our American trend lines on an array of domestic issues, whether it's entitlement spending, deficits, various social indicators, et cetera, are unsustainable and are going to at some point create real problems for the ability of the U.S. to maintain its role as a global leader. And yet both of them, by and large, I think it's fair to say, have taken a cynical approach to the issue, where basically they've decided that they're not going to spend their own political capital to take on these underlying issues domestically, and basically that they're going to punt it to the next president in the hopes that things don't blow up on their watch. So I mean, Obama basically campaigned on at a time, after he took office, after the financial crisis, despite the deficits that we had, he made a very deliberate choice right at the beginning of his presidency to take on healthcare. We ended up getting Obamacare, but what Obama really wanted was something closer to single payer. And yet he did so without really a corresponding program, either to catalyze and generate economic growth to pay for it, or alternatively to raise taxes high enough to account for it. So you had ballooning deficits under Obama, and I think he was well aware that this was not sustainable, but he basically just let it be. Likewise with the Trump administration and with Trump, they've first of all, I mean, Trump didn't, in the first place, even in a competitive Republican primary, when there were other candidates who were talking about entitlement reform, about enacting very pro-growth policies, with cutting the size of government, that wasn't something that Trump campaigned on. On the contrary, he made it very clear that he wasn't going to take on entitlement reform. And I remember actually when I was on the campaign, Sam Clovis came by our offices. He was one of Trump's earliest advisors. And I was asking Clovis, like, what the hell is this Trump saying about entitlement reform? Why is he saying he's going to protect Social Security and whatnot? I mean, he knows full well that that's not something that we can afford. And what Clovis basically said is, look, this is something that he talked to Trump about. Trump basically told him, look, there's no way I'm going to get elected railing against Social Security. What I'm going to do is come into office, get the economy going again. And then once the economy is going, then we'll bring up the entitlement issue. Now, it's total nonsense. I mean, for one thing, he didn't even have the votes to repeal Obamacare. It was a stunning policy choice. In a sense, I mean, he made the same choice as Obama did, which is basically not to enact a healthcare regime that would cut the costs of healthcare, but rather would increase or maintain and over time increase the role of government in healthcare. And then obviously now going into his reelection with low approval ratings, sort of like Obama, I mean, they just don't have they proved not willing to address a lot of the fiscal financial imbalances that would be necessary over the long term to maintain the foreign policy that they're overseeing. So all in all, I think Trump and Obama have been very similar on foreign policy. And just to recap what the 5 similarities are: one, the circumstances in which they came to power. Both of them came into office on a platform of American retrenchment, of devoting more attention and time to addressing domestic problems over foreign policy problems. 2, an ambivalent worldview when it comes to American exceptionalism, a certain realpolitik / morally equivocal approach to America's nobility and America's moral standing. 3, the decision to maintain the main lines of American foreign policy strategy since the end of the Cold War, and not to be a significantly revisionary president. for accommodating the Washington foreign policy establishment, appointing them to the vast majority of their positions rather than bringing in outsiders. And number 5 on domestic policy, basically permitting, indulging, I would say exacerbating an array of fiscal, financial imbalances on the domestic front, punting them to the next presidency, even though they presumably know that these are not sustainable ways to have a foreign policy of American global leadership. Anyway, so those are the ones that I came up with. Let me know if you agree. Let me know if there were other similarities or commonalities, or let me know if you disagree. And we'll see.